right, yalla. Miss Lederer. Miss Lederer. Okay. All right, good afternoon. This morning, the Secretary General spoke to Security Council members at the debate on the protection of civilians in armed conflict, where he stressed that the most effective way to protect civilians is to prevent conflict and to end them. He reiterated that conflict prevention, resolution, and peace building are and will remain the highest priority for the whole United Nations system. The Secretary General noted that although the global situation is bleak, with many regions suffering from displacement, food insecurity, and human rights violations due to conflict, there are some reasons for hope. This includes the growing recognition by many governments that respect for international humanitarian law and human rights law contributes to reducing conflict and countering terrorism. He called on member states to develop national policies to protect civilians in conflict and to ensure accountability for serious violations against them. Avoiding civilian casualties and providing unhindered access to humanitarian assistance are essential to end the cycle of instability and resentment and to make lasting peace and reconciliation possible, he added. His full remarks are online. The High Commissioner for Human Rights, Zeid Ra'ad Al Hussein, today issued a stark warning that the world, including Europe, is backsliding on human rights. Speaking at an event in Vienna marking the 25th anniversary of the World Conference on Human Rights, the High Commissioner said human rights are sorely under pressure around the world. And his remarks are available online. And in a report published today, the UN Human Rights Office and the UN mission in Libya say that violence in Libya continues to have a devastating impact on health care in the country. With hospitals and other medical facilities bombed, shelled, and looted, the medical personnel targeted and attacked, even taken hostage or arbitrarily detained, patients at times denied prompt life-saving care and attacked while getting treatment. Hassan Salameh, the special representative of the Secretary General for Libya, said these attacks are major violations of international law and tragic disregard for our common humanity. All too often, there's no respect for the sick and no sanctity for those who provide care. This must end, he said. Between May 1st, 2017 and May 1st of 2018, the United Nations recorded 36 attacks on medical facilities, personnel, or patients, although the actual number is likely to be significantly higher. And today in Syria, a convoy of estimated 400 people from Yarmouk arrived in MADIQ Castle in Syria's northern Hama governorate, following a local agreement reached between the parties. The UN was not party to these evacuation agreements. The UN continues to call on all parties and those with influence over them to ensure the protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure and to allow for safe, sustained, and unimpeded humanitarian access to all in need in line with their obligations under international humanitarian law. It's imperative that all those displaced are allowed to return voluntarily in safety and dignity to their homes as soon as the situation allows it. And just an update from the ongoing situation with the Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh. Latest reporting indicates that more than 7,000 people were affected by storms or landslides in the week of 7th to the 14th of May alone, and this at the start of this year's monsoon season. The monsoons typically deposit 2.5 meters of rain in Cox's Bazar, resulting in significant flooding. As a result, 150 to 200,000 refugees and 883 community facilities are at risk from flooding or landslide during this year's monsoon season, including 25,000 refugees at critical risks. The UN and its agencies are ramped up monsoon preparedness activities to try to mitigate the effect of rains on refugees. We recognize that Bangladesh has been dealing with monsoons annually and has developed experience in these matters. However, the situation present in the refugee camp is unique in scope and volume, and the international humanitarian community is working to support and protect the refugee communities most at risk. More flat land on the mainland or to temporarily relocate the refugees to would be appreciated. The lack of sufficient safe space for at-risk refugees and the lack of safe shelters limits our risk mitigation capabilities. And our humanitarian colleagues tell us the overall security situation in eastern Ukraine has deteriorated since the beginning of May. Hostilities with the use of mortars and heavy artillery were reported near some 26 settlements along both sides of the, quote, contact line in the last 24 hours only. Shelling has interrupted local gas and electricity supplies in at least 3 settlements along the contact line, affecting more than 10,000 households. The operations of the Donetsk filter station remain suspended, with risks at the water supply for 345,000 people. The filter station has been attacked on 8 occasions this year. The area of Advika in Donetsk province, with over 16,000 people, is already depleting its backup water reservoirs. Humanitarian partners have today started water delivery to the city. It's essential that all parties to the conflict respect civilian infrastructure and protect civilian workers. Any targeting of that infrastructure and intentional disruption of access to water is a violation of international humanitarian law. And our friends at UNHCR said they're seeing a significant increase in the number of people fleeing violence and persecution in the northern part of Central America. More than 294,000 asylum seekers and refugees from the north of Central America were registered globally at the end of 2017, an increase of 58% from the year earlier. This is 16 times more people than at the end of 2011. The vast majority of those fleeing are seeking refuge protection either in the north, in Belize, Mexico, and the U.S., or, and increasingly, in the south, in Costa Rica and Panama. And I was asked before the briefing about the situation in the Comoros, and I can say that the Secretary General is closely following and monitoring developments in the Comoros over the last few months, particularly since the holding of national dialogue process of the Assises Nationales in February of this year, and the recent announcements by President Azali Assoumani of the implementation of the constitutional reform as part of the recommendations of these Assises Nationales. The Secretary General urges the government, political parties, and all political actors, as well as civil society, to do their utmost to respect the rule of law, humanitarian rights, and individual freedom, and to work for the preservation of peace, stability in the country, and to allow for development and progress of Comoros. Today is the International Day for... Excellent. Thank you for paying attention. This year's theme celebrates 25th anniversary of the entry into force of the Convention on Biological Diversity. In his message for the day, the Secretary General stressed the rich variety of life on Earth is essential for the welfare and prosperity of people today and for generations to come. He added that while we know that many benefits of biodiversity, its loss continues around the world, and he called on governments, business, and people everywhere to protect the nature that sustains us. A couple of events I want to flag today. Right after the briefing, the Permanent Observer Mission of the Holy See to the United Nations will host a conference entitled Cops and Clergy Working Together, the work of the Santa Marta Group in the fight against human trafficking worldwide. Speakers will include Cardinal Nichols of Westminster, President of Santa Marta Group, the UK Independent Anti-Slavery Commissioner Kevin Hyland, and the Argentine Federal Police General Commissioner Nestor Roncaglia. And at 1:15 this afternoon, an interesting event in the trusteeship chamber called Women and the Origins of the United Nations, a Southern Legacy, organized by the Permanent Mission of Brazil. The chef de cabinet, Maria Luisa Viotti, will be speaking at the event, where she'll highlight the role of women from the South in drafting the UN Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as well as the current work of the organization doing to achieve gender parity. It'll feature a number of researchers who have looked into the unrecognized role of women in drafting the Charter of these United Nations.
Stéphane, regarding the plight the Secretary General has appointed a special envoy, a Swiss diplomat. Whatever happened to that? Has she become operational? Is she doing something?
Yes, she is operational. I think she, if I'm not mistaken, she's meeting the Secretary General today. Her focus is obviously on the situation in Myanmar and not so much on the humanitarian situation of the Rohingyas in Bangladesh, but obviously the future of the Rohingya refugees is part and parcel of the long-term situation in Myanmar. Mr. Lee. Yalla.
I'm just wondering how quickly do you expect her to travel to the region and to Myanmar?
I think fairly quickly. I think after today's meeting, we'll have a better idea of what her travel plans are. Mr. Lee.
Sure. I wanted to ask you, in what was called the John Ash case, a businessman, Mr. Chok Wing, has been identified as co-conspirator 3, and that was in the indictment. And it's caused quite a furor in Australia. But I guess my question is, given that the UN did, in that case, unlike the Patrick Ho case, conduct an audit, did the UN know the identity of co-conspirator 3? And what does it show you now, given Mr. Chok Wing's other roles? What does it mean for the UN that he, according to intelligence sources and now as stated in the Australian Parliament, paid a $200,000 bribe to a then-sitting President of the General Assembly?
I think we've commented on the case, and we have cooperated fully with the federal host authorities here on the conclusion of the case.
So this doesn't change the case. The idea that this is a person that's actually tied directly to the Chinese Communist Party.
I've said this is what I've had to say.
This
is what I've had to say.
Okay.
Thank you. Yes, madam.
Thank you, Steph. I wanted to raise a housekeeping issue. When I left my office on Friday afternoon, the air conditioner in my office was turned off. When I arrived on Monday morning, it was going full blast. My office was freezing. And when I went to turn it off, the dial was gone. So it was almost impossible to turn it off. I sent a note to Tal and found out that this was a new UN policy and that the dials on air conditioners in offices had all been taken off. I would like someone to explain this policy because it seems totally ridiculous, especially since the UN wasted money in my case by having the air conditioning going full blast when I myself had it turned off for several days last week.
All right, I will look into it. I think it has to do with trying to manage the temperature in the building, but I will look into it. Mr. Abadi, and I will come back to you, Matthew.
Thank you, Stéphane. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, speaking about the policies of Iran, said that that country could join the League of Nations. How do you interpret that?
The job of interpreting what people say is yours and not mine.
I thought you always defended the idea that IDs matter.
I do. I'm just saying it's not my job to interpret what the Secretary of State said.
Sure. I want to ask about Alicia Barsena in Sri Lanka, but I have a policy question, actually, since apparently today you're taking them.
Policy.
So I wanted to ask, having gone up yesterday to the 6 in a row credentialing ceremonies, I followed your instruction and didn't periscope, but it's left me wondering, again, given that others that came actually did shoot video, what the reason for the policy. And the reason I'm asking you this is that you might think that these are just, credentials and shaking hands, but many things were said. For example, and I wanted to ask you substantively about this, the new Kenyan ambassador said at the end of his presenting his letter, he thanked the Secretary General for his service. He called it the Global Service Development Model, very much thanking him for basically UN jobs increasing. Right. In Nairobi, which I don't think has been approved by the General Assembly. But so in any case, these events upstairs actually do have a news value. Maybe you don't see them, but I'm not denying it. And so I'd like to live stream them.
I know what you would like to do. We do not do live broadcasts from the 38th floor.
You never do them? Do you inform members of delegations that they can't use Facebook Live?
We do not do live broadcasts from the 38th floor.
By you, but you mean the Secretary?
That's as many words as I can use on this.
Doing it, and so it seems to me like, as a matter of policy.
Go ahead.
Are you able to give us any more details about the content of the SG's speech she's supposed to give on Thursday in Geneva on disarmament?
We will try to share some advanced copies of the speech with you probably by tomorrow evening. Okay. Mr. Abadi.
Thank you. Does the Secretary General think that killing civilians in armed conflict is a moral issue?
Of course it's a moral issue. Yes, sir.
Okay, great. I wanted to ask you on Sri Lanka, on these those who were deployed without being vetted. It was said, I think it was last week, that somehow an additional tier of vetting is going to be done by the Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka. They've said, this is a direct quote by the chairperson, that they don't know what the UN means by an additional tier, since there had been no vetting whatsoever to begin with, and so it's unclear to them.
Well, let me look into it.
Okay. And the other one has to do, I'm sure you've seen this, that Alicia Barcena, the head of ECLAC, has been named by Mexican presidential candidate and frontrunner Lopez Obrador. He said publicly that he would name her to be Mexico's ambassador to the UN. So I'm just wondering, what is the policy of a sitting UN? I mean, it's not her fault that she said that, but I'm just wondering, is there some procedure at the UN when a country or a frontrunner in an election says, you'll be my person at the UN?
Look, I can't comment. I don't know what the president said, but we expect all senior UN officials to apply the high standard of ethics.
One more policy.
Thank you.
Policy question?
We'll save it for tomorrow.
All right.